Hey, if you're here, can you post in the chat and let me know if you can hear my microphone and see my screen? Once I know if y'all can hear me, then we'll go ahead and get started with the lecture. Can't hear me? That's not good. Testing, 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 testing. Testing, 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 testing. Testing, 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 testing. All right, can you hear me now? All right, can anybody hear me? Let me know in the chat if you can hear me. Hello, hello, hello. All right, sweet. Awesome. Appreciate y'all. All right, so before we get started, just a quick introduction. My name's Ian. I run this Discord server. If you joined me in the past, then you kind of know what this is about, but this is our second episode of basically just doing various tech topics. In this case, we're going to talk about something called HTMX today for the next hour. We're going to have these live events happening weekly on Wednesdays, generally at 1 p.m. Central Time, except when we have guest speakers, and then it'll be at a different time that's more convenient for them. So this will be recorded and posted to the Discord and to my YouTube. So if you're unable to attend the entire thing and you want to rewatch it later, just know that it will be recorded, assuming everything goes well with the recording. So with that said, I'm going to just make sure that you all can see my screen real quick. So you should be able to see Repl.it on the left half of my screen. If you can, let me know in the chat. And then because right now I'm currently only working on one monitor, I'm going to go ahead and just go full screen with the browser, and that'll be that. So let me know if you can see the browser. It looks like someone said good. So you can see Repl.it on the left-hand side here. We'll go ahead and get started with it. And I'll check back in a minute in the chat just in case anything wacky is going on. All right, so before I do that, let me just pull up HTMX. Let's talk about HTMX a little bit because that's what today's topic is going to be. We are going to use Node.js, ExpressJS. I know a lot of you are familiar with JavaScript backend coming from courses like my course and Colt Steele's course. So we are going to use that for our API, but we're going to discuss HTMX for the front end. So traditionally, you can build a monolith application where you use a backend or full stack framework like ExpressJS or maybe Ruby on Rails or Django or Flask or Sinatra and so on and so forth. And so a lot of times in those cases, you'll use a template engine, something like EJS or ERB or Jade or Handlebars. There's a whole bunch of them. Eventually, you might migrate away from that and handle your front end entirely using something like JavaScript, some library, some framework, whether it's Angular, whether it's Vue, React, the list goes on. So what's happening there is that you're no longer really using HTML per se, you're using JavaScript to orchestrate the entire front end, which is fine, but it's not really truly JavaScript's job to do that. It's really cool that we can do that. JavaScript is a really powerful language and it allows us to do stuff like that. So it's great that we're able to figure that out. But it has created a lot of overcomplication and over-engineering. And so in an effort to kind of go back to the fundamentals of the web, essentially, this project HTMX was born. And so basically the concept here is that the foundation of the web is hypermedia. So if you're familiar with HTML, you know that stands for hypertext markup language. And every web page that you view on the web today is created with HTML. It has HTML in some form because that's the structure behind every web page. Whether it's built with React or it's built with Node Express or a combination of the two or any of the other hundreds of technologies that you can use to create websites, HTML has to be there. And if you want to style it, you have to use CSS. And if you want front-end interactivity, you have to use JavaScript. And for your backend, you can do whatever you want. And so HTMX is part of a larger paradigm, or I should say HTML is part of a larger architecture or system design that is hypermedia. And so hypertext is one form of media inside of this larger architecture. And so we have a HTTP protocol, which we send all of our requests over the web from our client computers to the server somewhere. And then we, excuse me, and then we get a response back. And in the case of like React.js, we'll get that response as JSON. We'll parse it. We'll inject whatever values we want from the JSON into our components. And then behind the scenes, React will see what's changed in the DOM and it'll create those updates for us. So if we're using something like EJS, then on the server side, the changes will take place, the mutations to the data or whatever it may be. And then the values coming from like our database, for example, will get injected into a template, an EJS template, which then gets rendered to HTML, which then gets sent from the back end back to the front end as HTML. So what HTMX is going to do for us is it's going to allow us to create dynamic user interfaces like we would with something like React or Angular, but without the use of those client-side libraries. So HTMX itself is really small. It's around 14K in a minified file. And I think they're hoping to get smaller as time goes on, but it's already pretty small. You can see here that it's reduces code base sizes by 67% when compared with React. And so I can already attest to that, having used it in some client application that I'm refactoring. The amount of code that I'm getting rid of and the amount of simplicity that I'm introducing into the project is unbelievable. So hopefully in today's demo, you'll get a taste of how we can build dynamic user interfaces with HTMX without all that extra bloat that comes with having to set up and configure and use a client-side library or framework. So just an introduction to HTMX. With HTML, we have what are called form controls or just hypermedia controls in general. It doesn't have to be a form. There's two of those. The first one is the anchor tag that we're all familiar with. So if we think of the hypertext from HTML, as a media that we can consume, right? A written media, then traditionally, way before World Wide Web, we would just have these documents and you would read them in a linear fashion from start to end. Now, as along the way, someone said, hey, it'd be really cool if we could jump from this page to this page. And not only that, but if we could jump to the middle of the page where the specific heading is. And so then the anchor tag was introduced. And they said, okay, you can either jump from one page to another page or to a fragment within a page using something like an identifier or an ID. That is traditionally a GET request. So we're getting something, we're just reading some information and displaying it on the page. So we're jumping from point A to point B and anywhere else. It can be within our own website, it can be from our website to someone else's website. That is how everything is connected on the World Wide Web. And then forms were introduced because at some point people said, well, this is great. We can read this information and now we don't have to do it in a linear fashion. So we have hypermedia, right? This is above and beyond your typical media. Now this is hypermedia because it has this interface that allows us to jump around. But what if we want to update this stuff? What if we're working on like a research paper or some type of business document and we want to be able to make some changes to it and have those changes come back to us live? So that's where the form was introduced. It sends a post method. So it posts information to a server out there using the form inputs, sends it in the body of the form as opposed to in the URL like in a GET request that you would use with an anchor tag. And then that information is processed on the server side. And the resulting HTML, the updated or mutated HTML, is sent back to you and then rendered on the page by the browser. So all of this is happening inside the browser, by the way. The browser is the main client that is handling all of the hypermedia architecture inside of it. And so it's what allows us to combine things like HTML with HTTP and CSS and JavaScript and blah, 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 and make it all into one huge interactive environment. So this is great, except it stopped there. There was get and there was post. There was anchor tag, there was form. Those were our controls, and then it stopped. And so that was limiting once we really started wanting to build more dynamic web pages. So we found ways around it. One of those ways was client-side libraries and frameworks. And that was great. It's allowed us to do a lot of really cool stuff, but it has gotten fairly complicated. And it's not to say that it's not the right tool for specific use cases, but in a lot of use cases, it's probably overkill. So returning back to HTML, this project, HTMX, extends it or augments it by adding the things that we are used to having with a dynamic JavaScript library, but with HTML syntax. So now we have these additional HTML attributes that can be placed on various tags, any tags, not just anchor tags and forms, allowing us to listen to events. So it used to be that you'd have a click event on an anchor tag or a submit event on a form, and that was it. But now we can listen to change events, mouse enter, mouse out, click event, input event, whatever events are available to us. You can review them in the MDN documentation, Mozilla Developer Network. We can use those events to trigger something. So that something traditionally was a GET request or a POST request. Now we can use everything. We can get a GET request, a POST request, a PUT request, a patch request, or a delete request. So we can send information directly to specific endpoints in our API. Again, we've already figured out ways to do this using things like method override, using things like fetch, but now it's built directly into our HTML syntax thanks to HTMX. So two main concepts there is that now we've augmented just having get and post in the forms of anchor tags and form tags, and now we have the full spectrum of our RESTful actions, so we can, or methods, so we can send get, post, put, patch, and delete. Okay. And we can do that based on any event on any element. It doesn't have to just be an anchor tag. Could be a div, could be a button, could be a span, you name it. So we're really upgrading our ability to create a dynamic interface still using HTML syntax. So in terms of a quick start, you can just include the CDN and then you can get using it right away. You can also download the code directly from the CDN for a production environment where you don't want to rely heavily on someone else's CDN. You can serve it directly from your own server. Alrighty, so we're going to head on over to Repl.it. Before we do that, I'm just going to jump back over here. Any questions? Nope. Okay. So I introduced Repl.it in the previous video, and the reason I'm doing it again here is because there's zero barrier to entry. You can literally just sign up for free, go create a new public REPL, and just say, I want not just an ExpressJS REPL, but I want an ExpressJS with HTMX. They already have that. And it'll give you the bare bones that you need to get up and running with an Express app really quickly. You can do the same thing for Laravel, you can do the same thing for Rails, whatever. They have a ton of stuff available. In this case, we just want to get up and running quickly with modern ExpressJS. And so the version of Express we're using is 4.18.2. And then I've introduced Mongoose and EJS. I didn't add node fetch. I'm not sure how that got in there. So this main file here, we'll just work through the files real quick and kind of talk about the code before we actually view the application and see what it does. But this index.js is our main entry point. So we're importing Express from the Express module, and then we are creating a new app from Express. And then we're going to configure our app to accept JSON, and the URL encoded is set to extended true, which allows us to have a request body from like a form. We're importing our function to connect to the database. So over here in a config directory, I have a database configuration. If we go take a look at that, you can see that I'm importing Mongoose again, and then inside of this default export, I have an async function called connect to DB, where I am connecting to the environment variable for my database URI. And this is just connecting to a MongoDB database out there on the cloud with MongoDB Atlas. So then we're setting strict query to false. This is just something with MongoDB 7. And then we're logging that the database is connected, and we're returning this object with the Mongoose connection and the client in case we need to do anything with that, which for now we're not. And we catch any potential errors and just log them to the console and make sure that we exit the process in the event of an error. So back over here, since we've imported connect to DB, we can await connect to DB. And now in the latest versions of Node, apparently you can do top level await, and that is not inside of an async function, which is great. So we do that, and the error handling is handled inside of the actual function itself. So if we have any issues there, we should see that in the logs. So then we import a post from our models directory, post.js file. You can see we have one file over here, post.js. Again, we're importing Mongoose, and we're getting a schema from Mongoose schema and creating a new schema that we're calling post schema. And this is where we define the schema for our post model. So what we're saying here is, hey, database, we're going to be creating this thing called a post. Therefore, you should store it in something called a posts collection, plural posts. And it's going to be shaped like this. So it's going to be a document that has a title attribute, which is a string data type, a body attribute or property that is a string data type. Really simple. It'll include an ID and the other stuff that it does by default. And then we just say, hey, this is a model. And that's what actually tells MongoDB to create a collection inside the database. So we export this as the default post variable here, capital P, since it's pointing to a model. So then over in index, we can import it. The very first thing I do here is, as part of this boilerplate, I just delete all existing posts anytime the server is restarted. And then I just create a single post just to make sure that the database is connecting and we're able to create a post with a title and a body. So hello world, this is my first post. If there's any errors, we catch them here and we just log the error to the console so that we can debug it. Now, because we're doing a kind of a monolith here, we're using EJS for our templating engine, and that's going to allow us to very easily inject values into the HTML without having to do a bunch of extra syntax. So we set our view engine to EJS, and then we start our routing. This is all in one file. It's a very small application, only like 53 lines of code. In the real world, obviously, you'd want to put this into a router and a controller, so on and so forth. So we have two routes. We get our home page with the /, and this is an async function, so it allows us to use things like await. And then we say, hey, give me all of the posts inside of the post collection in my database. So we do that with the post model. We just do a .find, no arguments. You could put an open close empty object in there if you want to, but no arguments is the same effect. We wait for the result. It comes back. Once that promise gets resolved, it assigns it to post here. And then I create this context object. And inside of it, I have a static heading called welcome to my website, and then the posts, which just points to those posts that we just fetched from the database. So then we're going to use res.render, and we're going to point it to index.ejs over inside of our views directory. That's this template here. Because we set our engine as EJS, we can omit the .ejs at the end of the file name. Second argument to render is going to be this object is going to include all of our local variables. So I just called it context. That's kind of a Django pattern, but it works for me. So, okay. So we'll look at this post route here in a second, but let's jump over to index.ejs. This is just regular HTML boilerplate for HTML5 document. And at the top, we have our heading variable injected with EJS. You can see that over here. Welcome to my website. This is just a little preview of the running website. We're at /, that's our home route. Here's that welcome to my website heading. Then we use the EJS syntax to include the post index partial. We also pass in the posts. The reason we have posts available to us is because in the route, we pass posts into the context, which is the local variable. So anything inside of here, like heading and post, will be available inside of our EJS file as a variable pointing to the value that it's mapped to inside this context object. So index.ejs, we have posts, and because our post index partial uses post, we have to pass it in using this include function. So we can jump over to post index inside of our views partials directory. This is really simple. It's just an unordered list. And inside of it, we're using EJS syntax again to iterate over those posts. We're saying post.for each post, give me a list item for each post. And inside of the list item, go ahead and inject the title of the post. That's why you see this bulleted hello world here. If you remember from index.js up here, we created a post with the title hello world. So that is what you're seeing there. This is our post index. We only have one post, therefore we get one unordered list item. Back over to index.ejs. After we have the partial for the post index, we have another partial for post create. So post create over here is just an H1 saying create post, and then a form with an action that submits a post method over to /posts, or it submits this body of this form using the post method. So inside of here, we have two inputs, the title input and the body input. The body input is actually a text area, and they're mapped to title and body in rec.body or request body. And that was that URL extended thing that I showed you earlier at the top of our boilerplate. So this URL extended allows us to access the information from the form that gets submitted on an object called rec.body, or whatever you call your requests. I usually call mine REQ. You could call it request the whole name if you want to. So that takes us to our post route here for /posts. Again, this is an async function. It allows us to use things like async await. We have a try catch in case we get any errors during the process of trying to create a new post. We are destructuring the title and the body from rec.body. Again, rec.body is the contents of this form. Each input and text area is mapped to its name. Its name is a property on this object rec.body. That happens because of the built-in express.url encoded extended true. So we extract the title, whatever value is inside this input, and the body, whatever value is inside of this text area, and store them in variables called title and body. Then we're able to use them to pass them to post create. If you really want this to be succinct, you could just pass rec.body here. We're not doing any form of sanitization here. We're also not checking for CSRF tokens, so don't use this in production. This is purely for learning purposes. There's no added security. So we create this new post using post.create, and technically this could be awaited. And so we don't even have to assign it to new post because we're not using it. But essentially we create the new post and then we redirect back to home. Now Repl.it is a little wonky, so things might look a little weird once we run this here in a second. We'll see what it does. So this is our preview here. And we have this form. Remember, this is the one, the hello world post that got created whenever we first turned on our application. We deleted all posts in our database and we created this hello world. Now here's the thing, we're gonna send a request, and if you watch this little spinny wheel arrow thing up here, it is going to refresh the page whenever it redirects us back to home, right? We're posting to /posts. And then once this logic gets run right here, it's going to redirect and reload everything. So it actually takes us back over to here where it looks for all the posts. We just created a new one, so it should find a new one. And then it's going to pass it through and render the index.ejs. So if we say something like another one, and then put some random stuff in there, and we submit this, you saw there was kind of like a flash and some weird stuff. Now source stock, I'm pretty sure that's a Repl.it thing. But all that to say, it had to go through to the server and then redirect to a different route and refresh. And there was a little bit of a kind of a blink. Now, depending on your environment and everything, you may not even notice the blink depending on how fast everything loads, but you will see some sort of disruption in the browser where it has to like refresh to a new route. Either way, it updated our interface here. Now the form is empty and we have hello world and then we have another one. So it worked. We were able to create a new post. Great. With React or Vue or Angular or any one of those front-end libraries, or even jQuery if you want to go old school, or even vanilla JavaScript, you can listen to the submit of this form. You can hijack the form, extract the values, store it in some type of memory in the browser, so create some sort of temporary state, and then send that to the backend API using a fetch request, wait for the response as JSON, and then update whatever area of the page. You can append this another one value here, or if you have a component, then the component will update based on the state change in a thing like React. Okay, so the experience of that is really dynamic and fluid, and it's nice, right? And you can even add some animations in there with CSS, whatever. You're not going to see a flash reload of the page, nothing like that. No matter how fast it is or how subtle it is, you're not going to see any of that, because that's the benefit of using these front-end libraries and frameworks. So how do we make that happen with HTMX? So let's go take a look at our partial. First things first, we have to have this script somewhere in our HTML taking us over to the HTMX CDN. Again, you can download this and include it locally if you want, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to link directly to the CDN. So with HTMX on the page, then you can start using HTMX syntax inside of your HTML. So because we have these partials, what it will allow us to do is, if we submit a form over to /posts here, rather than redirecting, we can take the post and we can put it, inject it into our partial for post index, and we can send it back to the front end. Now there's a couple ways we could do this. We could actually just take this post and put it in some HTML and send it back, and then we could let HTMX append it to the page. Or if we're lazy, we could actually find all the posts and we could, similar to what's happening over here, and we could inject it into the post index as opposed to creating a new partial just called like post show or something. And we could refresh the entire, not refresh, but we could update the entire unordered list. So we'll do that at first because it's the easier option, but then we'll look into actually just appending it to the end of the list as opposed to refreshing all the other items. Because if you've got 100 items in like a table or something, that's going to be a longer wait time than if you were to just take one single post and put it on the end, or put it at the beginning, wherever you want to put it. Just gonna hop over here, make sure nobody has any questions. Okay, so 1 second. Alrighty, here's where the magic happens. I haven't tested any of this beforehand, so we may run into some bugs. Totally fine, we'll work through it. So because this is all inside of a partial, we need to do our work inside of the post create. That's where our form lives. So traditionally, our action is what dictates where the request gets sent. If you didn't include an action, it would just send it to whatever URL was in the URL bar, which in this case would be /. We don't have a post route to handle any post requests to /. Sorry, I know the word post is being used a lot. There's two distinct posts that we're talking about, by the way. We have our blog posts, or whatever you want to call these, posts that we're creating, and then we have the post method, which is the method of the request that's being sent from the client, our browser, to the backend. I'll try and differentiate between the two. In any event, the action is what indicates which API endpoint that we send the form data to. So what we can do is we can remove that, or rather we can replace action with HX. This is the preface of all of your HTMX attributes, which, by the way, the full preface is data.hx, but you can make it shorter just by doing hx. That just lets you know that we're using data attributes to create these custom attributes. If you're not familiar with data attributes, it's essentially a way for you to create your own custom HTML attributes. So you can put any type of information you want on any tag, and then you can pull that information simply by accessing the data attribute for the tag that you have selected in JavaScript, and you can see what's available to you. You can do whatever you want with that data. So here we say HX and then we say post because this is a post request. We no longer need the method post over here, I don't think. I don't think it matters if we leave it or take it out. But now here's the thing. This is going to post this form data on a submit. You can do an HX trigger and you can set it equal to, in this case, submit. But because we're on a form tag, if I'm not mistaken, this is happening by default. So we'll leave it there just to be explicit, but if it gives us trouble, we'll come back and look at it. Okay, so this should operate the same exact way that it has been, in that it's going to submit this information to the backend, to /post, but rather than redirect after we process the request, we're just going to directly send back HTML. So we're going to use EJS to inject our dynamic content into there based on what's updated, the new post that gets created. But that gets sent back just like you would send JSON when you do like a fetch request to an API endpoint, except it's going to be sent back as HTML. And then because we're using HX posts, behind the scenes, HTMX is going to be handling that response to figure out where it needs to be updated. Now, by default, if you exclude the HX target, then I think it would actually update the element that submitted the request to begin with. That is not what we want to have happen. We want to do an HX target. And inside the target, you put a CSS selector for the element that you want to update with the response from the API. So let's go look at post index. Here we have this unordered list and we can give it an ID and we can call it posts. And so we can even be super explicit and we could call it post-list. Okay. So then that means over in post create, we can say HX target is the hash indicator for posts, which, by the way, now that I have all these different attributes, I'm going to break them up onto multiple lines just for readability purposes. But the HX target is going to go to that post-list. And so what that means is when the response comes back, we get the HTML back. HTMX is going to say, okay, where's that post list ID? That's what I want to replace. Now, by default, I think it replaces the inner HTML. But because we're using the post index partial and we're getting back the entire thing and the ID is on an element that lives inside of the partial, we're actually going to do an HX swap. We're telling HTMX, hey, this is the method by which I want you to swap the content. And so just use outer HTML. So all these things should be familiar to you if you already use vanilla JavaScript, and that is, replace inner HTML or outer HTML, or select an item by its selector, in this case hash post list for an ID. This is all just typical vanilla JavaScript stuff, except now we're including it in our HTML using HTML attributes. There's not a line of JavaScript being written here. It's all happening behind the scenes with HTMX. So it's abstracted away from us in a really small 14K file, and we just get the benefit of just writing out these simple attributes in HTMX and our HTML. Okay, so let's double check here. This is saying send a post request to /post with the data from this form whenever the form is submitted. Target the post list with the response that gets swapped out using the outer HTML method. So then over here, we say here's the ID post list. What is required to swap this out is that we have all of the posts. So that's what's going to change in our backend. So over here, now that we've created the new post, we actually have to get all the posts. So we have to say const posts is equal to await post.find, open close parens. To be explicit, you can do the curly brackets. You don't have to. You can omit it the same way that we did whenever we did the find up here. And so it's going to give me back all the posts. And then rather than doing a redirect, we're going to render. And rather than rendering the entire index like we do here, we're simply going to render. We're going to look inside partials because the default folder that it looks in is inside views. So we go, hey, look inside partials. And then there's going to be a file called posts.ejs, again, because we're setting EJS as our default for the view engine, we can omit the file extension at the bottom here. So just posts will point us to, it's not actually post, it's post index. So post index, and then you can include EJS, you don't have to. And then this is our context object. We're just putting in the object as a object literal here. And then in, I would say recent, but in recent years, you don't have to include post. If these both have the same name, then you can just omit the right side of the colon, including the colon. So this is saying, hey, key post is pointing to value posts, or if you just want to shorten things down, you can just say, hey, pass in the post, okay? So there's our res.render. This is sending back the partial post index. It's going to populate the post that we just found after we created the new one, therefore including the new one. And that gets sent back to, wrong place, to our HTML. This is included here, so it's actually going to get sent over here. And this is what is handling all of that, okay? So we'll review that in a moment because I know that was a lot of this, that, without explicitly saying what was going on. So we shouldn't have to refresh the server. Let's see if it does it for us or not. We might have to turn it off, turn it back on. So we're going to say hello world 2.0, and then the body doesn't really matter. We're not displaying it. And so here, let's bring this down. I kind of want to see the full experience. If we click submit, moment of truth. Very interesting. All right, so something wacky is going on here. You'll notice that we didn't get a full refresh, but suddenly it's including welcome to my website, and there's a whole nother form. So we did get the hello world 2.0 here, but something isn't right. So let's look at this and see if we can figure out what we did wrong. So the response is including, and I think I know why, the response is including the entire index template. So that tells me, and y'all may have already seen this while I was typing, that in the route, oh, interesting. I told it post index and I told it partials, but for some reason, it's still sending me back all of the index.ejs. So there's some debugging that's going to have to happen here. We're going to be a little more explicit with these, but let's see if we can figure out what is happening. So technically what should be happening when we send the HX post is it should go to /post as a post request, triggered on form submit. It should target the post list, so the hash post list ID, and then it should swap out the outer HTML of post list with the contents of the response. Again, I don't think we need the method here anymore, so we can remove that. I don't think it was causing us any trouble, but you never know. So then if it's targeting this, it should only send back this area, the post list. And so then it should just update post list. Now because we're using partials, there might be a small issue here. And we can debug that in a second if it happens again. So let's go ahead and stop the browser or stop the server and rerun it. And let's see what we got going on here. Okay, so first things first, just to explain, whenever the server restarts, I delete all the posts and then I create one single post. So that's why we see hello world. So then if we type something here and we click submit, it worked this time. Okay. Don't know what it was that we did that fixed it, but it could have been any one of those things that I removed. So just to test something real quick, I'm going to put and it could just been the server restart. That's the whole like, did you turn off your computer and restart it sort of thing. So two things to learn here. So real quick, I'm gonna put the method back in. But first is if you're gonna debug one change at a time. I just did like 4 changes at once and just kind of like threw the kitchen sink at it, and that's fine. It worked. It did what I wanted to do, but now I don't know which thing it was that fixed it. So as far as like retrospect, if it were to happen again, I would have to go through each item individually, trying to figure out which item solved it. So we're going to restart our server. I put method post back in here because I'm not sure if could have been what was causing it. Oh, interesting. This time it's not sending it. We're going to get rid of that again. That could be what's giving us trouble. Now it's not sending. Oh, there it is. Okay, it took a second. Oh, which brings us to our next thing. And that is that when you send a request, it gets sent to the server in a traditional like monolith, for example, where you're letting the backend handle the template. Then it redirects, and so then the page refreshes. So it's not always super obvious to the user what's happening, but once the page refreshes, then they know. In this case, because we've switched to this dynamic user interface where we're kind of doing what we do in React, it's helpful to include some sort of information on the page that lets the user know that something is happening. I just pressed submit and I didn't know what was happening. I'm like, is this working? And what it was is Repl.it free version. It's just not super fast. So there's a little bit of latency there. And so it would have been nice to have like a spinning wheel or something, an indicator that something was happening until this item was included at the bottom of my list. So let me show you how you can do that because HTMX has that built in. I don't have a spinning wheel offhand. You could go get like line items. If I can get the line item CD and I can create one in a moment. But first we'll just do it with some text, okay? So the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna use something called, oh gosh. You have to create an item with a class. So let's just do it down, let's do it above the form. So we'll say H2. Oh, I don't have my keyboard shortcuts inside of here. And we'll say loading, ... And then we'll give it a class. And then the class is just HTMX indicator. And so what happens is when the page first loads, HTMX indicator, whatever that is set to opacity of 0, meaning it's invisible. It's still going to take up that amount of space, so there's some things you can do to fix that. So for example, if I refresh the page, now notice that big empty space. That's because that's where the HTMX indicator lives. If I refresh, there's the loading thing. So not ideal, but just for the sake of showing you what's happening, we'll add some additional CSS in a minute to make it look pretty. But anyway, so if I refresh, the loading's going to disappear. Here's my form down here. And HTMX indicator, oh gosh, it's supposed to live inside of the element. So yeah, until we add the CSS, we actually have to nest it inside the form. So let's do that. So we'll put it right here at the very top of our form. Just try to format it a little more nicely. So you're not going to notice a difference visually. It's just that the reason you do this is because what happens is when you submit this element, it's going to create it's going to add a class to this form element, whatever element it is that is triggering the event, in this case, the form submit. And it's going to add a special class to it that as long as it has HTMX indicator as a child of that class, yes, it would be a child, then it knows to turn it on, meaning if it's styled to 0 and visible right now, once we click and send this trigger and everything starts happening behind the scenes, it says, hey, also set the child of this parent element, the form, HTMX indicator, to 1 in terms of the visibility. So let's stop, restart, and then we'll run it and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, so it doesn't matter the title, whatever we want. And then when I press submit, look at that. Oh, okay, so you'll notice that it flashed on and then it disappeared. That's because now the latency is a little bit quicker, but we'll do it one more time just so you can see. So you'll notice I'm not resetting my form yet. That's something that you can add. Obviously you don't want the form to contain that, but we're running out of time here. So for the sake of simplicity, we'll just continue with what we're doing, but just to show you the loading thing, again, you'll notice it happens fast, but for the duration of the request to the API, the user is now notified that something is happening, okay? So we can say, hello world, blah, 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 submit. And just for an instant, while we were waiting for that new one to come back, it said loading. Isn't that way better? Just this whole experience of just having, granted, it's just text. There's no CSS. It's not beautiful, but there's no like send to the backend, redirect, refresh, give you the whole thing of HTML. It's just this little tiny piece of HTML that comes back. HTMX says, go ahead and update that area of the page. Now you can go a step further. You don't have to replace the post index. Likewise, over here in your post route, you don't have to send an additional request to get all the posts to populate the post index. What you could do is you could just take that brand new post that you created, assign it to a variable, inject it into a partial that simply has a list item with the post title, send that back in your res.render, take that with your HTMX, and then just update this unordered list here. We only have a few minutes left, so I can't get into that now. I might add it after we get off the call and then just share it so people can see it. But the other thing I was going to show real quick, let's just do line awesome CDN, because this is just slightly nicer looking than just having text that says loading. This is what I do in my client application, is we'll get the minified CDN for line awesome from font awesome. And hopefully this is the right one. So then over in our index.ejs, up here underneath our title, we will just include a link tag. And I was hoping for some automated stuff there, but I didn't get it. That's okay. So then let's see, link, href, that should be sufficient. And then now that we have that, let's go over to our form, post create. And then down here where we have loading, rather than saying loading, what we should be able to do is this can be, it might be able to do it on H2. Typically you do this sort of thing on like an I tag, but I think you just do LAS, maybe it's LAS, LA spinner. Let's take out the HTMX indicator first so it's not invisible so we can test and make sure it's working. Okay, it's not, maybe it's LAS spinner. It's not working. All right, hold on. Let's go to line awesome, the website, make sure we have the correct code. Again, it might want it on an I tag. So first, let's make sure that we have the correct CDN here, Content Delivery Network. It might have been helpful to set the rel as a style sheet. I'm not sure that makes a difference, but we'll find out. And so, go ahead and get rid of CDN.js. Go here and then just go to icons. Where's the somewhere in here, we should be able to search the icons. See if we can find spinner. Oh, there's a bunch of them. All right. Where is the animated ones? I just want animated spinner. Okay, cool. Oh, there's a ton of, okay. All right, we're just gonna pick one. But and then what? You just copy. Oh, this is interesting. This is not the interface I'm used to, but we'll see what the link does when we copy that. So let's go back here. And if I paste that in, it's not what I want. Let's refresh this now that we have the other CDN in here. And I'm going to jump over to here and see if I can just pull up my implementation of it so I don't waste y'all's time. So I'm going to jump here. Hopefully there's nothing, no environment variables or anything that you can see. All right, so I'm going to look for an LA spinner. Let's just do spinner. Where is that LA spinner? Oh, okay, I see what's happening. That's fine, I'll add that in a second. So then down here, this is what I want, LA dash spinner. let's jump over to here. And we're going to do this inside of create. And we're going to replace this H2. So it's, okay, it was LAS, LA-spinner. Oh, why is it still not visible? That's so annoying. I'm curious about this, which CDN I'm using. So let me go to my boilerplate and I have it included as it's, all right, well, that's not going to work. I'm wasting too much time on it, and I want to do a little bit of Q&A. So sorry we couldn't get that working, but it would have been fun. So in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're just going to continue to have the H2, and then the class is going to be HTMX-indicator. And inside of here, anything that you put in here is going to be invisible. So we'll just say something like loading. Okay, so if we refresh, and then we submit something, there it is, it flashes on the page. And then as soon as you get the HTML back from the API, then it makes it invisible again. Now, because it's just invisible and it's not actually using the display property of none, you get that big empty space where it lives. Not ideal. And so what you would want to do is you'd want to go into your CSS and add just a couple lines. And in fact, they include that in HTMX. If you go to the docs, which the docs are great, they've got everything that you want. But if you go into the docs and you look for HTMX indicator, and you go down here, you can see here's the CSS that you plug in. And so what this does is it actually sets the display to none. You can see what happens is the indicator is the thing that you want hidden, but the element that triggers the event actually gets an HTMX request class added to it during the duration of the request. And therefore its child element, which is the indicator, will then be displayed in line for the duration of it. So you can actually have it to where it doesn't have to be a child element. You just have to play with these settings here. That is like the simplest of the little fancy things you can do. You can do CSS transitions to where when new content gets added to the page, when the response comes back and you populate whatever area of the DOM with that HTML, you can use CSS transitions to make things fade in or slide in or however you want it to look. And it just makes the whole user experience even better. So unfortunately, we only have a couple minutes left and we can't get into all that. But I highly encourage all of you to go to htmx.org. They have a free book that you can read, but they also have really great documentation. The book is more of like a what it is, what the history is, why you should use it sort of thing. I think they do some example applications. And they talk about the architecture of hypermedia as a whole. And then in addition to that, you have these wonderful documentation that has all these different use cases. And you can go to examples and you can see a whole bunch of really cool things, like a progress bar, for example. You click on start the job and then you get this progress bar. This is all HTML with attributes. And then you just have some CSS here for the actual progress bar. So pretty cool stuff that you can do. All right, so jumping back over to Discord. We have just a couple minutes here, so I'm going to stop streaming. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Again, for anybody that showed up after I mentioned this, these free lectures are going to be happening once a week on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Central Time, unless we have a guest lecturer coming in, which we do have some scheduled for the future, one in particular in March, a couple weeks from now. Theirs will be at whatever time is convenient for them. So it may be in the afternoons or the evenings or things like that. All right, what major sites are using this, if any? I don't have a list of websites that are using it. You can check out, they have a Discord server for HTMX. They also have a group. I don't know if it's an official group, but there is a group on LinkedIn where they have jobs specific to the use of HTMX. Also, if you go watch the Primogen on YouTube, pretty popular YouTuber, he used to work for Netflix, might still work for them. He uses it for a lot of internal tools. So with something like this, it can be kind of difficult, especially on a much larger team with huge projects, to come over and say, hey, I just discovered this new cool thing and it's way better than XYZ technology. We should just revamp everything. Obviously, you're going to get a lot of pushback there. But anytime there's a ticket for a new internal tool or a little project or whatever it may be, then as you're designing the architecture of that code base, you can say, hey, I think it would make a lot more sense to use HTMX. We can get this built a lot more quickly, and it's still going to have that wonderful user interaction and interface that you would expect from something like React. So to answer your question, I don't know any specific sites that are using it, but I'm sure if you join the community on their Discord, you could probably get some answers there. Yeah, no problem. All right, we got a couple minutes here. Anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? Again, this, assuming the recording works, I will upload this shortly for posterity's sake. Anybody that was unable to attend live or anybody that wants to go back and review any specific parts can view the recording once it gets uploaded. All right, cool. Thank you everybody for attending. Another one of these is going to happen again next week, same time, Wednesday, 1 p.m. Central Time. We're going to be doing Python basics because that'll be a predecessor to the following week where we're going to do Python classes. Those 2 specific weeks will be Python, but we are going to have a diversity of topics. Like we did HTMX today. Last week we did PHP, HTML, CSS. In the future we can do React.js, all sorts of stuff. So go to the feedback channel, let us know what you're interested in, and then just be on the lookout for future updates about topics that we're going to be lecturing. Thanks everybody that showed up. Appreciate y'all. Thank you in the chat. Look forward to seeing y'all around the server. Everyone have a good rest of your day or night, and we'll see you later. Peace.